Welcome back to part 2 of our tutorial of making the Dodge game in Code Studio. Now, last time I left you, we had this on our screen. We had created a variable for our player and added a sprite to it. And we did the same thing for UFO1, our first enemy sprite we're battling. And I left you with the challenge. Can you make UFO2, assign the sprite to it, and place it in the bottom left of the screen? Alright, so if we're going to do that, the first thing we need to do again is to create a new variable for our new UFO. So we drag this create sprite block in that has our variable statement here. Again, this is called declaring a variable when you create it for the first time and you give it a name. So let's call it UFO2. And I asked you to put it in the bottom left of the screen. So it should be somewhere around here, looking at our X and Y values, probably like X for 100 and Y for 300 is going to be perfect. And again, we need to add the set animation to actually attach the sprite we came up with to it. So I need to say again, we're doing this to variable UFO2, and we set animation to UFO blue sprite. And let's reset it, draw it again. Oh yeah, we have to make it smaller to match the scale. So we had UFO 1 at a scale of 0.4. We can just copy this down there. Now when I'm doing this tutorial, I'm mostly going to be showing you how to do this with our blocks, but there's going to be times when actually it might be easier to switch to our text view, which is what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to take this UFO.scale, I'm going to copy this. So I'm going to highlight it and use Control-C to copy it. And I'm going to paste this right after we set our animation for UFO2. New line, Control-V lets us paste. And I'm going to just change this number to UFO2. And now if I run our code, hey, that works. The other thing I want to do while we're in text view is that this all just kind of looks like a mess of code right now. It's kind of hard to tell where something starts, where something stops. So one thing good programmers will do in their code is they will use spaces where it helps them to organize code. Now the computer will completely ignore these extra spaces when it runs the code, so it doesn't hurt to have as many spaces as we want. But as you can see, I'm just separating each of our variables here, just so we can kind of organize all this code is for UFO1, all this for UFO2, and so on. And then when I go back to show our blocks, it adds these little space blocks in, makes it just look a little bit nicer. Alright, the last thing we need to do before we get on the new stuff, remember I had you name this Dodge game part 1? Well, we're going to make a part 2 now. So to basically copy what we've done and create this as a new project, we're going to use the remix button. So go ahead and hit remix. It's going to save it again. It loads a new page. Now it says remix, Dodge game part 1. Well, let's rename this. We don't care for it to say remix at the beginning, so get rid of that. But we're going to want to call this part 2 and hit save. Alright, so now we are ready to roll. The next thing we need to do to make our game working is going to be to actually be able to control our player and make our player move. So before we do that, I want to create one more new variable. So in your toolbox, click on the Variables tab. And we have a couple blocks we can use to start or declare a variable without the whole create sprite string attached to it. So I'm going to take this one that says var x equals blank, and I'm going to drag this in under our player because we're going to use this for our player. I want to name it player speed. Again, one word. I capitalized the S for speed just so we can see that's the second word in there. Var player speed, and let's give this a value for now of, let's just call it 2 for now. Why we're doing this is because if we create a variable at the beginning for our player speed, as we're testing our game, if we feel like our player is moving too slowly or too fast, it makes it very easy for us to change the player's behavior in one line of code rather than, as you're going to see, going and editing many different lines of code. So how do we actually make our player move, though? To do this, we're going to need to create a new function. So remember, functions are what actually the actions in our code, what our code is doing. So in our functions tab, we're going to drag this blank function block that says my function, and let's drag it underneath our draw function. Let's call this move player. Again, make sure the names for all your variables and functions give you a hint of what that block or that code actually does, what it means. It's going to make it much easier for you to understand what you're doing later on. All right, so what we need to do, let's think about this. We want to move our player up if we're pushing the up arrow. We want to move our player down if we're pushing the down arrow, and so on. So what we want to do to make this happen is we want the game to check if we are pushing one of those keys. And if we are pushing one of those keys, then it's going to move our sprite to the place we want. So we can do this by using under control. We have a block called the if statement. We are going to use this block a ton. What it does is it detects if a certain condition we describe is true, then it's going to do whatever code we put inside the block. If this condition is not true, it's going to completely ignore all this code. So go ahead and drag an if statement into our move player block. So if, what do we need to check if is happening? Well, we need to check if we're moving a key. Let's go ahead and start with moving left. So under world, I'm going to look for a button that says key down. Key down basically means, are we holding a key on the keyboard down? Let's drag this block in right here where it says if key down. Let's go ahead and set this to left right now. Now, some people like to control their game on the keyboard by using the W, A, S, and D keys. If you're used to playing any first-person games on a computer, that's normally how you control them. I'm going to leave my example just using the normal arrow keys for now, but feel free to change it. If you want to use the W, A, S, and D keys, just highlight the word left, and you can replace it with the word W, and that'll work just fine. I'm going to leave mine at left. I think that's what I'm supposed to say. Yes, left. Okay. So if we do push the left arrow key, what is going to happen? We're going to need to change something about our player sprite. So let's go back to the sprites tab, and I want to look for something called velocity. Velocity, again, refers to how fast an object is moving in a certain direction. There's two velocities we have. There's velocity x and velocity y. Velocity x is going to set a value for how fast our sprite moves on the x-axis, and you guessed it, y sets the speed on the y-axis. So let's start with velocity x right now. With Code Studio, I can just grab this, and if I drag it in here, notice it lets me put it in here, and it adds this purple block to it. Now, just so you know, this purple block is actually under the Variables tab, and it's this one, Assign a Variable. We're going to use this a lot, because what this is really saying is we're taking a variable, which we might as well set right now to say player, because we're, come on, player, because we're talking about our player. We're going to take our player variable, and we're going to modify its velocity x property and set that to a new value. Well, let's do some math for this. I want you to take a math block, and we're going to take this star, which again means multiply in computer world. So let's drag the star into this box. So I want to multiply two things. If we're moving left, that means our x value, if you look at the numbers down here in the corner, our x value is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So we want to go in the negative direction if we're moving left. So I want to take -1 multiplied by, and remember up here we created this thing called player speed, this variable called player speed. We want to refer back to that variable. So all we have to do in the second space is just type the word player speed. Now make absolutely sure you spell it correctly. You type it exactly the same way you did up here. If you add a capital letter when you declared the variable, it better be capitalized down here too, or you're going to get an error, or your code is not going to work. It's going to be annoying. All right, so should we see if this works? Let's see if this works. All right, so if I push the left arrow, nothing's happening. Why is nothing happening? Well, the reason is because if we look at our draw loop, right, again, this is what the game is really looking at. It's only going to really do whatever's within this function, draw. So we need to actually call the move player function within our draw function. To do that, let's click on the Functions tab. I'm going to drag call a function into the draw. I'm going to put it above draw sprites, and we just need to change the name to match our function down here. So the move player. And now let's reset it and try again. Okay, good news and bad news. Good news is it moved. Bad news is it's not stopping. And the other bad news is it left this purple, that's brown streak right there. I don't know why I can't read colors today. All right, so how do we fix this? Well, let's do one step at a time. I think it'll help us if we add our right arrow key. Maybe then we can at least stop from continuously moving left. So if you didn't catch what I just did, I pushed this little plus sign on our if statement, and that's going to add a little bit more room here. And it says else. And actually, I want you to push it one more time because we're going to need 2 more spaces in this if statement. So the way the code is going to read, it's first going to check if we're moving left. If we're not moving left, it's going to check if we are moving right. So we want to do basically the same thing we did here, but instead of moving in the negative direction, we want to move in the positive direction. Let's start by checking for the right arrow key. Go to World, and we wanted key down. Drag this in here, if key down, and I'm going to check right. Again, if you want to use a different key, just type in the key you want, and then we want to make it move. So again, really I'm taking this variable, assigning a variable. I'm dragging that there. And then the first variable we're modifying is actually our sprite velocity x. So if I drag that in there, again, I need to actually say what sprite I'm talking about, which is our player variable. Velocity x is going to equal, I need to drag in my multiplication operator again. And this is going to be a positive 1 times player speed. All right, so now if I run this again, okay, I'm still moving, but if I hit right, yay, I start moving back. And then if I hit left, yay, that's great, I'm moving back left. But again, I can't actually stop. What if I want to just stop moving left or right altogether? Well, there's one more thing we can do. With our last part of our if statement, if we're not pushing left and if we're not pushing right, what do we want to happen? Basically, we want this velocity to equal 0. We want no motion on our x-axis. So let me just take our sprite velocity x and drag this in here, and we just want to set this to 0. Okay, let's run this in error. We can't figure out, I'm going to do this all the time, aren't I? Remember to rename the sprite once you drag it in. So this should be player.velocityx, reset, and run. Yes, when I let go of the left arrow key, I stop. Let's test the right, going right, and stop. Good. All right, so now our left and right motion is working okay. The problem, though, is, again, you're looking at this ugly mess here. Why is that happening? Well, if you look at our draw loop, the first thing it's doing is drawing however we move our player. What that's really doing is it's seeing where are we moving our sprite, and it's basically painting that sprite on the screen again. But again, notice the computer is stupid. It's not getting rid of the sprite we just drew. And that's why if you look really closely, you can see all these outlines of our person, our player. So we need to basically reset our background every single time we redraw the frame. So to do that, let's go to drawing, and we're going to take a background. I'm going to draw this. I'm going to put this actually very first thing in our draw loop. I'm just going to leave that as white for our background. Feel free to set it to a different color if you want. You could even add pictures in there if you can figure that out. Let's try it again now. Hey, that's much better. The only other thing I'm feeling is our player's moving really slowly. Now that might actually make it kind of challenging trying to dodge the UFOs, but it just feels too sluggish. I don't think it's going to be very fun. So let's go up to our player speed variable, the very top of our code. We had it set to 2. Let's just try changing it to 3 for now. Let's reset the game, run it again. That's a little better for now, a little bit faster. We might change that later, but I think we can leave that as it is for now. So here's going to be your challenge for this part 2. I want you to set up the player movement on the y-axis now. So again, that means moving up and down on the screen. If we push the up arrow, it's going to move our player up. And if we push the down arrow, it's going to move the player down. I'll give you one little hint before I cut you loose. We can add multiple if statements within the same function. So what I would recommend you do is start with a brand new if block. Drag that in right here underneath our first if block. And then think about what we did for left and right. You want to basically replicate this for up and down on the y-axis. All right, give it a try. I'll check back in with you soon.